Welcome to another episode of your morning cup of cow shit. Oh man, the Park Service has been throwing a lot of ammunition our way. So this will be more like a teaser of things to come than a complete episode. So they sent out that embarrassing email last week trying to defend themselves against the exposure that the article Apocalypse Cow caused. And They basically were arguing over mundane details and wording. For example, you don't call it Point Reyes National Park. It's a Point Reyes National Seashore. So the person said park, and I guess that means nothing else should be acknowledged in the article. But did you know that the Park Service's own website refers to it as a park multiple times? Just make sure you don't use park in that arrangement of words. Don't ever say Point Reyes National Park, but Point Reyes National Seashore can be referred to as a national park, even on their website. But don't ever actually say Point Reyes National Park. Otherwise, you're discredited. By the way, legally, if that article had said anything inaccurate, they would have to take it down. And as the author has just published, they wrote to the Park Service multiple times saying, here's why we're accurate. Show us why you're right and we're wrong. No response. That's when the Park Service took to emailing their followers. Instead of actually being proven correct, which they weren't, they then took to trying to manipulate the situation. That's a National Park Service doing that. That's a federal agency doing embarrassing things like manipulating their followers using an email blast to try and show their version of what happened, which was just them twisting words around. They really didn't refute anything. But since the Park Service wants to go this path of nailing people or trying to criticize people for inaccuracies, I've decided to finally release some of the inaccuracies that I have been keeping tabs of on them. What better place to start than the Tule elk controversy and the water issues? And this was included in the Park Service's pathetic rebuttal, and they said, we never admitted that they died of thirst. And it's true, they never used the words died of thirst. They said death was related to drought conditions, lack of water may have played a part, etc., etc. But besides that silliness, I want you to go to the blog post that I just published and count how many times the Park Service contradicted themselves. Things such as necropsies that existed but then didn't exist, a contingency plan that existed but then you find out later didn't really exist, and then finding out that bottom line is the management plan says they won't use the contingency plan anyway. So why are we going around in these circles? Telling people that they had published an updated water map, which they would have gotten away with, except that citizens confronted them about it, and they had to later concede that, we did not update the water map. We just like to say that we updated the water map because it sounds good. And unless someone's paying attention, they would have gotten away with it. I think people need to understand that the Tule elk management plan basically is a plan for the elk to die. I don't think a lot of people realize that. And maybe that's why we're getting sent on this goose chase, talking about whether or not they died of water and whether or not we should bring in water or if it was malnutrition, because that's better than just plain telling the public the truth in that the plan is for the elk to die. Now, some of you will make peace with that. You'll be comforted by the fact that it's an official Park Service management plan, so that makes everything okay. Okay, fine. But just be awake in your approach to this from now on. Don't play any games in your mind that saving the elk is or ever was a plan, the elk are always going to be allowed to die in that elk reserve because that land was always known to not be sufficient for a growing population of animals. And you can say, well, that's carry capacity. That's how that works. Except that you're leaving out the fact that animals are being allowed to starve to death or die of thirst. They don't just vanish into thin air when they reach carry capacity. They die pretty messed up deaths, all because they aren't given a fighting chance to save themselves. I mean, how messed up is that? Not even a fighting chance to save themselves. But after they all die, not all of them, but after you have a die-off, like the one several years ago where 50% of the herd dies, well, when that population rebounds, how do you think that population rebounds? Who is there to mate with? Themselves. That small population, the 50% that remains, who are already a subset of a small population. What's that tell you about the gene pool there? What's that tell you about the genetic variation? What's that tell you about viable offspring? Each time this happens, the gene pool gets smaller and smaller. These animals aren't going to be able to survive in the long run thanks to a management plan because it's the Park Service, because they worked with California Fish and Game, or now they call themselves California Fish and Wildlife, but just change it back to Fish and Game because that's what that organization is about. It's about making sure there are enough wild animals for hunters to get to keep hunting. They are seen as game. The bottom line is that these animals are subjected to cruel conditions. So if you want to be impressed by the Park Service and official plans, that's one thing, but don't call yourself an animal advocate. This is messed up. This is like visiting a zoo where when the zoo runs out of funds and stops providing food for the animals, it's in their policy that it's okay for those animals to starve to death. That's essentially the same thing. The elk management plan knows that these animals were doomed inside of that area. But back to the game of talking about whether or not they died of thirst or if they died of malnutrition or deficiencies, this or that and the other thing. Again, people take the Park Service at their word because they're the Park Service. They must be experts, right? Well, you would think experts would be able to answer a question such as, how much water does a tule elk require on a daily basis? You can find that information for most animals out there. We certainly know how much water cattle need, because apparently we value cattle more than we do an endemic rare species in California. Park Service did not know the answer. This is the only national park that has tule elk. They have these animals at their fingertips. You'd think that they would be chomping at the bit to take advantage of the opportunities to study these animals and learn as much as you can. Not to mention that at the end of the last die-off, Dave Press of the Park Service was quoted to say, "This is a great research opportunity. We have our ears to the ground now." That's kind of a calloused response to 254 animals dying, a great research opportunity. But my point is that no research was done. It was a great opportunity, but the Park Service, again, did nothing. Where are the studies that have taken place since that time? Where are the studies that have taken place since the tule elk management plan? And it was a legitimate scientist, Judd Howell, who studied the elk at the seashore for a period of time, who said to me, where are the park's peer-reviewed papers? Where's their science? Without that, they're just stating opinions. It's unsubstantiated. But we, the public, accept it because it's the Park Service. Well, if you're going to repeatedly tell people that the elk have plenty of water, shouldn't you know what plenty of water is? How can you say it's plenty if you don't even know how much those animals need? And yes, if you look hard enough, turn over some rocks and stones or dig into the mud, you'll find moisture. So technically it's true that water was available out there. Is that enough for animals to survive? Side note, it doesn't matter because they don't expect them to survive. But while we take this approach of it's cool for the elk to struggle because they're wild animals and there's plenty of water for them, at the exact same time, during the heat waves, during this water crisis, the cattle had access to foal ponds, multiple foal ponds. The pastures were full of troughs, not just the old troughs, but new troughs being brought in to give the cattle even more water. And if that wasn't bad enough, then the ranchers were allowed to start pumping water out of natural water sources like Kehoe and Abbott's for their purposes. So while on one hand we're saying, hey, there's plenty of water, don't worry about the elk, extreme measures are being taken during those same conditions to get water to the cattle. That's gotta be a wake-up call. One of the park's embarrassing rebuttals to both citizens in emails and in the email that they sent out contesting the Apocalypse Cow article is that if there was no water in the reserve, then all of the elk would have died. What? What is your point? Who said there wasn't any water? I mean, there's a lot of people out there. Maybe somebody wrote in on that, but nobody who's been following this closely. The argument is that there isn't sufficient water to keep the population alive. Some are going to eke out enough to get by, and who knows how diminished their health status is. They might make it through, but they're the ones that just eked by. And yes, we did find moisture out there. It was very low quality moisture, especially compared to what the bovines get to have, which the bovines turn around and just poop in their own water. But in the meantime, the elk, all of the elk, not just the elk, all the wildlife in Tomales Point, in the elk reserve, have to share that little bit of water that can be found. So, I mean, it's like saying, hey, this isn't a problem unless 100% of the elk die. We're cool with 50%. If 50% of the population dies, that's fine. That doesn't mean that there's a problem. They still have plenty. Those are their words. That's why I keep repeating it. I couldn't believe it when I read it. Plenty of water. Wild carcasses are popping up all over the place. But until every carcass is on the ground, this is not something to deal with. Anyway, please go and read the blog post that's on the homepage of shameofpointraised.org today. It references a lot of data that I've been collecting over the months. You know, this isn't pulled out of the air or made up. This is in writing from citizens I've been speaking with who have interacted with the Park Service and have been told basically an ongoing set of deceptions, not just over the weeks or months, but since it's the same lines as the last die-off, then years.